Today I'm going to show you how I decorated this Cookie Monster cake. Come join me. I started with putting a bit of icing onto my cake board so my cake doesn't slide around. This is going to be a 2-tier cake. Both will be chocolate. Bottom will be 2 9-inch and the top will be 3 6-inch. So I'm starting with just kind of covering this cake. It is going to be filled with peanut butter icing. So after I cover this, you'll see me momentarily adding the peanut butter filling. So I'm adding a bit of a dam here so my icing doesn't poke, or my filling doesn't poke out. And I'm adding that peanut butter filling. After that's added, I'm going to add my second layer to this tier. And I'm going to move on with covering this cake. Using my bench scraper to really smooth up those sides. Now moving on to the second tier here. So I'm adding some icing to the cake board and I'm cutting down this first layer because I want to be able to put a bit of a pretty good amount of peanut butter filling in this cake. So I do want to make a little bit of a divot here in the cake to make space for that. Adding my second layer and going to cover this part of the cake. At this point, I wasn't quite sure if I was going to have this be 2 or 3 layer tier, so I'm going to cover this fully and then I will be deciding as I'm working on this what it will be. It does end up being 3 layers, but I'll add that in a minute after covering it fully. So here's where I decide that it's going to be 3, and I am cutting into this piece of cake because I'm going to be making a cookie jar and I want it to look like there is a hole in the top of it. So I'm making this pretty deep as I'll be putting cookies inside of there once it's done. So now I'm going back and I'm getting ready. I'm adding some peanut butter filling in between that second and third layer of this cake. And I'm going to add that third layer. And now I'm going to cover that as well. Just working on smoothing out the icing on this top tier. Now I'm kind of trying to decide where I'm going to kind of put some shape into my cookie jar. So I'm just kind of dragging my knife along and then I'll move on to a spoon and I'm just carving out some some of that cake and icing. This is where some of the shape of the cookie jar will take place. And then you'll notice that that top lip is a bit tall, so I will go back and I'll cut a portion of that off just to make the proportions better in my cookie jar. There's where I'm cutting it off, and so now you see that I cut off my my open part of my cookie jar, so I'm going to have to go back in and I will be cutting into that again, so I have a space to put my cookies once the top tier is done. And there we are, cutting that space out. And once I have that out, I'm going back in and icing this cake and covering it for the final time with that crumb coat. Going back to the first tier, and I am just cleaning up those edges to make it a nice crisp edge. Next thing I want to do is add some of the supports to the bottom tier. So this is some of those small dowels that I'm using. I'm going to put 6 in this because my top tier is a 6-inch cake. And then I'm going to cover those up with some icing and also some peanut butter so that those holes are covered and the next tier has a place to sit on top of this cake. Now we're going back and we're putting that final coat onto our cookie jar. Making sure that I have that space open where my cookie jar shape is. Here I'm using a flimsier tool to help me to clean up the cake to smooth the sides. And we can see it's beginning to take shape. Just continuing to work on it to keep those edges more rounded, to make it look more realistic. All right, going back to the other cake, I'm going to put this together. I have now shaped up the cookie jar completely, so we're ready to stack the cake. So I'm going to take off that bottom cake board. There are two cake boards on there. One is right up against it and one is bigger so I could work with it. So I'm just dropping that onto the bottom tier, and I'm going to send a center dowel down through the entire cake, the top and bottom, and down into the cake board. Going to cut off that excess and continue pushing that down into the cake so it's nice and sturdy. Now I'm going on and I'm making some of the fondant decorations. So the first thing I need to do is I need to make his eyes. I'm doing 2 white pieces. I'm going to make the 2 smaller pieces for black pieces for his eyes. You can see in the background that I've already done the letters, but I have my videos a bit out of order here. I'm also going to be making his mouth right here. So just kind of shaping that up a bit. And here's the clip where I was making the letters that'll go on the cookie jar. And I'm adding a little bit of Crisco to each of these pieces to get that excess powdered sugar off of them and to make them brighten up a bit. And with that being done, it's time to move on with decorating the bottom. So I'm using a grass tip and I'm just going to use some blue icing and just cover this entire bottom cake with this bottom tier with blue icing for our Cookie Monster head. Here I'm using some piping gel and I'm adding his smile. And going back to adding more of that blue icing to the entire cake on the bottom. This was by far the most tedious part of this cake. Here I'm taking a paintbrush and I'm just kind of cleaning up the bottom board a little bit. And back to adding more to the cake, more of that blue fur. Now I'm moving on to adding his eyeballs. So I'm using some piping gel and I'm just sticking each of the whites of the eyes onto the cake and then adding the black piece on top of those. And now I'm adding the word cookies onto the cookie jar. And with that, this is what it looks like on the front. And now I'm going back in and I'm adding some cookies to finish off this cake. So I'm adding some to the side, I'm adding some to the top of the first tier, and I'm also going to add some up into the top of the cookie jar. You'll notice I'm putting some that are laying flat, some that are kind of stacked against the side of the cake, and I'm using some blue icing to hold them in place and kind of placing the icing so that it's touching the already blue part of the cake. Here we are filling up the top of that cake. I'm breaking them in half so that they look like they're kind of peeking out from the cookie jar. I'm also going to add some broken pieces of cookie because we know that when Cookie Monster gets cookies, he's just uncontrolled with them. So just going to put some broken pieces around the cake on each layer. And with that, that completes our cake basically. And this is what it looked like with a full spin. So if you enjoyed looking at this cake and watching me decorate it, I encourage you to come back again as I do other content. To make sure you don't miss any, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. Also like and please comment. That certainly increases engagement. Thank you for joining me and please come again.